On June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach, a Sherman tank named Fury is struck directly. The crew abandons it. The mission appears over, except for one soldier who refuses to give up. Sergeant Curtis Culin had no engineering degree, no special training, just a wild idea involving scrap metal and a welding torch. His commanding officer thought him mad, but what he crafted in 48 hours would change the entire invasion. One damaged tank, one determined mechanic, and an invention so simple yet so brilliant that even Eisenhower himself ordered 5,000 copies to be made. This is the untold story of how a sergeant with a blowtorch saved D-Day. Stay until the end, because what happened next stunned everyone. Normandy, France. June 1944, 6 days after D-Day, and the Allied advance had come to a standstill. Not because of German tanks, not because of artillery, but because of hedgerows. These weren't just decorative hedges you might have in your backyard. Norman hedgerows were ancient barriers, thick walls of earth, stone, and tangled roots, created by farmers over centuries to mark property boundaries. Some were 15 feet tall and just as thick, their roots digging as deep as 10 feet or more. They were natural fortifications, covering Normandy like a maze. For American tank crews, these hedgerows became death traps. Every time a Sherman tank tried to climb over one, its most vulnerable part, the underside, was exposed. German soldiers, waiting on the other side with anti-tank weapons, would simply fire as soon as the tank's belly showed. One shot, one kill. Over and over again, Sergeant Curtis Culin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron watched this nightmare unfold. Tanks approaching the hedgerows would tilt up as they tried to climb, and then erupt in flames. The crew rarely survived. Those who did were often severely burned or traumatized. The medics were overwhelmed. The morgue was overflowing. The situation was dire. The Allied forces had expected to be 30 miles inland by this point, pushing towards Paris. Instead, they were stuck, making only small advances. Every field became a new battle. Every hedgerow, a new problem. The Germans didn't need massive reinforcements, just these natural barriers to pick off American tanks as they exposed themselves. Culin wasn't an engineer. He had no formal education. Before the war, he had worked as a mechanic in New Jersey, fixing cars and trucks. But he understood machines, leverage, and force. As he watched yet another Sherman tank burn after trying to climb a hedgerow, an idea suddenly clicked in his mind. The problem wasn't the hedgerows themselves. The problem was that the tanks were trying to climb over them instead of going through them. If they could cut through the hedgerows at ground level, the tanks wouldn't expose their vulnerable underbellies. The Germans couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. But how to cut through 10 feet of compacted earth, stone, and roots? These hedgerows had withstood centuries of weather. They weren't going to yield to anything short of massive force, applied in exactly the right way. Culin started sketching ideas in a notebook he always carried with him. His crewmates thought he was crazy. Cullen's at it again. They'd joke, trying to solve the whole war with his drawings. But Culin ignored the skepticism. He knew that people often underestimated mechanics. They assumed that because you work with your hands, you didn't also use your mind. But every good mechanic was a problem solver. Every repair was a puzzle, a challenge. He saw the hedgerows as just another puzzle to solve. And he had an idea. He approached his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, with a proposal that sounded insane. He wanted to take a damaged Sherman tank, one that had been hit but was still mobile, and weld steel prongs to its front. These prongs would be made from German anti-tank obstacles, called Czech hedgehogs, which were scattered all over the Normandy beaches. These prongs would act like giant knives, digging into the hedgerows and ripping through the earth and roots, creating a path for the tank to plow through. Captain Morrison stared at him for a long time, trying to understand. You want to take a tank that's already been shot at, weld scrap metal to it, and drive it full speed into an earthen wall? He asked. Yes, sir, Culin replied calmly. The current plan is to drive tanks over hedgerows, exposing their belly armor to German fire. My plan will keep the armor facing the enemy at all times. The Germans can't shoot what they can't see. Morrison was silent for a moment, considering the logic. It was risky, but it might just work. How long do you need? Give me 2 days, some welding equipment, and permission to scavenge metal from the beach obstacles. I'll have a prototype ready. Morrison made a decision that would change the course of the Normandy campaign. "You've got 48 hours. If this doesn't work, we're both going to be explaining ourselves to some very angry generals." Cullen set to work immediately. He requisitioned acetylene torches, welding equipment, and a work crew. He headed to the beaches where the D-Day landings had taken place. The beaches were littered with German defensive obstacles, the very obstacles that had been intended to stop landing craft. Now, they would become the material for his invention. Cullen and his crew worked tirelessly, cutting the hedgerows apart, trimming the steel beams, sharpening the tips, and reinforcing the welds. By the end of the first day, they had 4 prongs ready, each as thick as a man's leg and as tough as railroad track. The next phase was delicate. They had to weld these prongs to the front of the Sherman tank without compromising its structural integrity or interfering with its movement. Cullen calculated the angles and positions carefully, making sure the prongs were low enough to dig into the base of the hedgerows, space wide enough to clear a broad section, and strong enough to withstand impact. By dawn on the second day, the modified Sherman tank was ready. It had 4 massive steel prongs attached to the front, extending like the tusks of a mechanical beast. Soldiers gathered to look at the strange contraption. Some were impressed, others skeptical. Captain Morrison examined the tank carefully, testing the strength of the prongs. After a long silence, he nodded. "All right, Sergeant. You've built your contraption. Now you need to prove it works." The next morning, the tank set out to test its capabilities. Would the prongs dig through the hedgerows, or would they snap upon impact? Could this wild idea actually work, or would it fail spectacularly? But as Cullen watched the tank plow through the hedgerows, he knew one thing. This was the only chance they had to break the stalemate and advance. If his invention worked, it could save hundreds of lives. It was time to find out. The modified Sherman tank rolled toward a particularly thick hedgerow selected for the test. It was a monstrous barrier, 12 feet high, ancient, and seemingly impenetrable. Several officers had gathered to watch, including Captain Morrison and Major Jack Williams from Division Headquarters. The tank's crew had volunteered for the test: Driver Corporal Jake Mitchell, Gunner Sergeant Tom Harrison, and Loader Private First Class Danny Chen. Whether they were brave or crazy, perhaps both. As they sealed the hatches and the engine roared to life, the assembled soldiers fell silent. Cullen stood with the observers, his heart racing. Everything he had calculated, everything he had built, was about to be tested in the next 60 seconds. If it worked, it would revolutionize the Normandy campaign. If it failed catastrophically, good men might die, and he'd be the one responsible. "Ready?" Morrison asked, glancing at Cullen. "As ready as I'll ever be, sir," Cullen replied. Morrison raised his arm, then dropped it, signaling for the tank to proceed. The engine of the Sherman roared, belching black smoke from its exhaust. With increasing speed, it charged directly toward the hedge, 30 tons of steel heading straight for an immovable object. The impact was thunderous. The entire tank shuddered. Earth exploded outward. Roots snapped with a sound like rifle shots. For a moment, the tank seemed to stall, embedded in the mass of the hedge. The soldiers held their breath. Then, slowly at first, the Sherman began to move forward. The steel prongs were working. They dug deep into the ancient earthwork, creating leverage and ripping through roots and stone. The tank tilted slightly forward, maintaining its nose-down position, ensuring the belly armor stayed facing the enemy. More roots snapped. Dirt cascaded from the tank's hull. The engine screamed with effort. Then, with a final push, the Sherman burst through the hedge, emerging into the field beyond. The tank had created a perfect breach, wide enough for other vehicles to follow, and low enough that the tank's vulnerable underside was never exposed. The soldiers erupted in cheers. Cullen felt his knees weaken with relief. It had worked. His wild idea had actually worked. The crew of the Sherman popped their hatches and emerged, grinning. "That was the smoothest hedgerow crossing I've ever experienced," Corporal Mitchell shouted. "We barely felt the impact, and we never exposed our belly to enemy fire." Major Williams approached Cullen, his expression serious. "Sergeant, how many of these modifications can you produce? And how quickly?" "So, if I get enough welders and access to more hedgehog obstacles, my crew could modify 10 tanks a day. Maybe more if we push hard," Cullen replied. "Not good enough," Major Williams said, and Cullen's heart sank. Then Williams smiled. I'm going to get you 50 welders and all the steel you need. I want 100 tanks modified by the end of the week. I'm sending a report to General Bradley immediately. This invention is going to change everything. Captain Morrison clapped Cullen on the back. Congratulations, Sergeant. You're no longer the mad mechanic. You're the genius mechanic who just saved the Normandy campaign. But Cullen wasn't celebrating yet. So, with respect, one successful test doesn't mean it'll work in combat. We need to try this against an actual German position with real enemy fire. That's the only way to know if it's truly effective. Morrison nodded gravely. I thought you might say that. There's a German strongpoint about 2 miles from here. They've been holding up our advance for 3 days. Battalion wants it taken, but every approach is blocked by hedgerows. Every attempt to cross has been suicide. If your modification works there under fire, it'll prove your concept beyond any doubt. When do we go, sir? Tomorrow at dawn. I'm assigning you to the tank as a technical advisor. You'll ride with Mitchell's crew. If there are any issues, you need to see them firsthand and understand why. Cullen swallowed hard. He had hoped to stay back and work on more modifications. But Morrison was right. He needed to see his invention in actual combat. Only then would he know if the design needed any improvements. Only then could he honestly say it was ready for mass production. Understood, sir. I'll be ready. That night, Cullen checked and rechecked every weld on the modified Sherman. He tightened bolts. He examined the prong for any stress fractures from the test. Everything looked solid, but combat was different from a controlled test. In battle, nothing went according to plan. Private Chen found him working late by lantern light. Sergeant, you should get some rest. Big day tomorrow. Can't sleep? Chen. Too much thinking. You scared? Chen asked. Cullen considered lying, but decided honesty was better. Terrified. This thing works in theory. It worked in one test, but tomorrow people's lives depend on whether I got the math right. If I made a mistake somewhere, if there's a flaw I didn't see, it could cost lives. If you made it, Sergeant, it's solid. You know this tank better than anyone. Tomorrow, we're going to plow through those hedgerows and show the Germans they can't hide in them all. Cullen wished he had Chen's confidence, but all he could do was prepare as best he could and hope that his mad idea was truly genius. Tomorrow would be the real test. Dawn broke over Normandy with a cold drizzle that made everything look gray and miserable. Cullen climbed into the Sherman tank, taking position in the commander's cupola, where he could observe and give technical advice to the crew. His stomach churned with nervous energy. The plan was simple. Their tank, now nicknamed Rhinoceros by the crew, would lead a small column toward a German strongpoint. They'd use a hedgerow cutter to breach the barriers that had previously stopped all advances. Infantry would follow closely behind, using the breaches to advance without being caught in the Germans' killing zones. Mount up, came the order. Engines rumbled to life across the staging area. The Rhinoceros shuddered and began rolling forward, its steel prongs gleaming wetly in the dawn light. They approached the first hedgerow. Beyond it, according to intelligence, was a German machine gun nest that had been mowing down American infantry for days. The usual tactic would be to try climbing over the hedge, exposing the tank's belly to German anti-tank weapons. Steady, Cullen said over the intercom. Hit it at a slight angle, about 20 degrees. That'll help the prongs bite in. Roger that, Corporal Mitchell replied, adjusting their approach. The impact came with a bone-jarring crash. Earth and roots exploded around them. Inside the tank, the crew was thrown forward against their restraints, but nothing broke. The prongs held. The tank pushed forward, its engines screaming, its tracks churning, ripping through the centuries-old growth. And then they were through, emerging on the other side to find a shocked German machine gun crew scrambling to reposition their weapon. The Sherman's main gun fired first, one high-explosive round that eliminated the threat before the Germans could react. It works! Chen shouted over the intercom. It actually works in combat. But there was no time to celebrate. More hedgerows lay ahead, and behind each one could be enemy troops. The Rhinoceros continued its advance, breaching hedgerow after hedgerow. Each time, the prongs performed perfectly. Each time the tank emerged before the Germans could bring anti-tank weapons to bear. The infantry, following close behind, were ecstatic. For the first time since D-Day, they could advance without being pinned down by hedgerow defenses. They poured through the breaches, clearing German positions that had seemed impregnable just hours before. Then came the real test. Intelligence had warned them about a German Panther tank, a far more dangerous opponent than infantry, positioned behind a particularly massive hedgerow. The Panther's 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at long range. If the rhinoceros got stuck breaching the hedge, it would be a sitting duck. Contact front. Harrison called out. Panther, partial cover behind the hedge. Cullen's mind raced. They could retreat, call for artillery, play it safe. But that was what the old tactics would have dictated. The whole point of his invention was to change the rules. Breach the hedge, Cullen ordered. Don't stop for anything. We go through fast. We emerge with our gun already aimed where the Panther is. Mitchell didn't hesitate. The Sherman surged forward. The impact was massive. The hedge was thicker than any they had encountered before. For a terrifying moment, the tank seemed to slow, the prongs struggling against the dense mass. More power. Cullen shouted, "Give it everything." The engine howled. Smoke poured from the exhausts. The tracks threw up huge clouds of earth, and inch by inch, the rhinoceros forced its way through. They burst through the hedgerow at an angle, not perfect, but good enough. Harrison kept his gun trained on the location where the Panther should be. As they emerged, there it was, its turret still rotating to track their unexpected appearance. Harrison fired first. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's side armor, which was thinner than its frontal armor, and penetrated. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its hatches. Its crew bailed out, and the rhinoceros's machine guns persuaded them to surrender rather than fight. The infantry caught up, securing the German prisoners. An officer approached the rhinoceros, grinning broadly. "Sergeant Culin, I don't know what kind of witchcraft you worked on this tank, but you just did in 2 hours what we've been trying to do for 3 days. That German strong point is finished." Cullen climbed out of the tank, his legs shaky. He had done it. The design worked, not just in a controlled test, but in actual combat against real enemy positions under fire. His wild idea had proven itself. Captain Morrison arrived shortly after, his radio crackling with reports from other units. "Sergeant, I just got word from Division. General Bradley himself wants to see you." Apparently, Major Williams' report made quite an impression. "They are calling your invention the CQIN hedgerow cutter, and they want 5,000 of them manufactured immediately." 5,000. Cullen could barely process the number. His little modification, built in 48 hours from scrap metal, was going to be mass-produced and deployed across the entire Allied armored force. "Sir, I'm just a mechanic. I'm not sure I should." "You're the man who solved the hedge problem," Morrison interrupted. "Own it, Sergeant. You just changed the war." The Sherman's engine roared louder, and within days of the rhinoceros's combat success, every tank depot in Normandy received orders to begin installing Culin hedgerow cutters. The Army brought in welding teams from engineering battalions, scavenged more Czech hedgerows from the beaches, and set up assembly lines in fields, working around the clock. Cullen found himself pulled from his unit and assigned to train welding crews. He traveled from depot to depot, teaching welders the exact angle for the prongs, the proper welding techniques, and how to reinforce the modifications. Some welders were initially skeptical of the design, but when they saw the combat footage of rhinoceros tanks plowing through hedgerows that had stopped everything else, skepticism turned to enthusiasm. They worked faster, taking pride in the modifications they were installing. General Omar Bradley visited one of the tank modification sites personally. He found Cullen elbow-deep in a welding project, training a new crew. "Sergeant Cullen, I presume," the general said, smiling. "Yes, sir." "At ease, Sergeant. I came to see the man who unstuck my army," Bradley said, smiling. "Your invention is brilliant in its simplicity. We've been throwing sophisticated engineering solutions at this problem for months, but yours just worked." For weeks, the hedgerow problem had plagued the Allies. Artillery barges, explosive charges, modified dozers, nothing worked consistently. Then, Sergeant Curtis Culin arrived with scrap metal and a welding torch, solving the issue in just 2 days. "Sir, I just did what needed doing," Culin modestly responded when General Bradley praised him. "That's what good soldiers do," Bradley replied, finishing with, "I'm recommending you for the Legion of Merit and authorizing a field promotion to technical sergeant. This army needs more men who can think outside the box." After Bradley left, Cullen's crewmates crowded around him with congratulations, but Cullen felt conflicted. While he was being lauded as a genius, receiving medals and promotions, the war was far from over, and men were still dying in Normandy. His invention was helping, but it wasn't a cure-all. It didn't change the past. Private Kowalski, who had helped with the prototype, pulled him aside. "You okay, Sarge? You don't seem too excited about all this." "I am, Eddie. I just keep thinking about all the crews we lost before this invention," Cullen confessed. "What if I'd thought of it sooner? What if I'd pushed harder to get it tested?" "You can't think like that," Kowalski said firmly. "You can't save the guys who died before, but you're saving the guys who are still alive. Every day, more tanks with. Your cutters are rolling through hedgerows. Every day, fewer crews are burning. That's what matters." Cullen knew Kowalski was right, but the guilt still gnawed at him. During quiet moments, he thought about the crews that had died trying to climb over hedgerows in the early days after D-Day. If only he had worked faster. If only he had been more insistent. But war didn't give you time for what IFS. It demanded progress. It demanded that you keep moving forward, keep solving problems, and save whoever you could. As the Culin hedgerow cutters saw widespread use, soldiers began reporting back with suggestions and modifications. The cutters worked brilliantly, but there was always room for improvement. Some tank crews added a fifth prong in the center to improve cutting performance on particularly thick hedgerows. Others experimented with serrated edges, which helped the prongs grip and tear through stubborn roots. A few creative tank commanders added reinforcement plates to protect the welds from enemy small arms fire. Cullen embraced all these modifications. He had never claimed his design was perfect, just that it worked. "The best ideas come from the guys actually using the equipment," he explained to a visiting war correspondent. "I came up with a basic concept, but dozens of tank crews have contributed improvements. This isn't just my invention anymore. It belongs to every soldier who's made it better." One particularly clever modification came from a crew in the 3rd Armored Division. They noticed the cutters sometimes got clogged with packed earth and roots, reducing their effectiveness on subsequent hedgerows. They added a simple mechanism, inspired by agricultural harrow equipment, that cleared debris from the prongs automatically as the tank moved. It was a small change, but it meant tanks could breach multiple hedgerows in succession without stopping to clear the cutters. Cullen immediately incorporated this improvement into his training for new installations. "See, that's genius right there," he'd tell welding crews. "I never thought about debris clearance." Some tanker in the field saw the problem and fixed it. That's how good engineering happens, iteratively, with input from the people actually using the product. The Germans responded to the hedgerow cutters with confusion at first. After-action reports captured their bewilderment. Enemy armor is now passing through hedgerows without exposing vulnerable areas. Unknown how this is being accomplished. Once they figured out what was happening, the Germans tried various countermeasures. They reinforced hedgerows with hidden mines. They positioned anti-tank guns at angles to catch breaching tanks. They even created fake hedgerows as traps with pre-positioned anti-tank weapons waiting for the tanks. But none of these measures worked consistently. The fundamental issue remained. The Culin cutter allowed tanks to breach hedgerows while keeping their thick frontal armor facing the enemy. As long as the Allies used proper tactics, the Germans couldn't effectively counter the new capability. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and raced across France, the hedge cutters had become standard equipment. New Sherman tanks rolling off production lines in the United States had cutter attachment points welded in place. The field modification had become an official part of tank design. Culin had literally changed how tanks were built. As Allied forces pushed into the more open terrain of inland France, the hedge cutters saw less use for their original purpose. But tankers quickly discovered that the cutters had other applications nobody had anticipated. In urban warfare, the steel prong proved excellent for smashing through brick walls and wooden barricades. crews used them to breach buildings where German snipers had taken position. The psychological effect was devastating. Many German defenders surrendered rather than fight when they heard a 30-ton tank crashing through a wall. During river crossings, crews found that the cutters provided additional traction when tanks had to climb muddy riverbanks. The prongs dug into the slippery soil, preventing the tanks from sliding backward at critical moments. In winter warfare, the cutters acted as massive snowplows, clearing paths through snowdrift that would have otherwise bogged down vehicles. Culin, now a master sergeant and attached to an engineering evaluation team, traveled to different units to study these creative applications. He took extensive notes, sketched modifications, and recommended design improvements based on field observations. "I never imagined my hedge cutters would be used for all this," he wrote in a letter home. "I just wanted to get through Normandy hedgerows, but soldiers are creative. They'll use any tool for whatever purpose serves them. My cutters have become multi-purpose battlefield tools." The most unexpected application came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. As German forces launched their last major offensive, they created extensive roadblocks using felled trees to slow Allied counterattacks. Tank crews discovered that the hedge cutters could push aside or break through these tree obstacles, allowing armored columns to maintain momentum even when roads were blocked. One after-action report described a Sherman crew using their cooling cutters to literally push a disabled German tank off a narrow road, clearing the way for an entire American column. The cutters hooked under the German tank's gird armor, and with some effort, our Sherman was able to shove the obstacle aside, the report read. This unconventional use of the hedge cutter prevented a multi-hour delay, which could have compromised their tactical objectives. Culin found that story particularly amusing. "I built a tool to cut through bushes," he said, "and now they are using it to move disabled panzer tanks. War makes you creative, I guess." But not all the news were positive. Some tanks suffered equipment failures when cutters were used beyond their design specifications. The prongs snapped off when tanks tried to push through reinforced concrete obstacles. Welds failed when crews used the cutters to try to lift heavy objects. There were even friendly fire incidents when other units didn't recognize modified tanks and mistook the prong's silhouette for enemy equipment. Culin worked with Army engineers to develop better training materials. "The cutter is a tool, not magic," he emphasized in training sessions. "It has limitations. Use it wrong, and you'll break it or get someone killed. Use it right, and it'll save your life and help you complete your mission." By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, the hedgerow cutter had become so standard that new tankers barely remembered a time when Shermans didn't have them. The innovation had become normalized, integrated into doctrine and tactics. For Culin, this was both gratifying and slightly melancholic. His invention had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but success meant that people had forgotten it had ever been a problem. Captain Morrison once told him, "When people can't imagine it ever being different, you didn't just solve a problem. Culin, you made the problem disappear so completely that nobody even remembers it existed." Not everything about the hedgerow cutter's success was positive. There were costs and consequences that Culin hadn't fully anticipated. The first cost was human. When tanks gained the ability to breach hedgerows rapidly, infantry commanders began using armor more aggressively. Some attacks that might have been delayed or canceled in the pre-cutter era were now launched with the expectation that tanks could overcome hedgerow obstacles. This led to some units being pushed into situations where they took casualties that better caution might have prevented. Chaplain Thomas O'Brien, during a rare moment of reflection, quietly remarked, "You gave them a tool that saved lives." O'Brien continued gently, "What commanders chose to do with that tool, the tactical decisions they made, that's on them, not you. You can't control how people use what you create. You can only try to create things that do more good than harm." There was also the matter of the German defenders. The hedgerow cutters had undeniably shortened the Normandy campaign, which saved countless Allied lives. But it also meant that the German soldiers, who might have survived a longer, more cautious Allied advance, were instead killed in the faster push that the cutters enabled. Culin understood, intellectually, that this was war. The goal was to defeat the enemy. But emotionally, it was harder to process. "I killed people I never saw," he confided to Kowalski one evening. "Not directly, but my invention put tanks in positions where they could kill more effectively. I'm being decorated for that. Medals for making killing more efficient. It feels wrong. Somehow. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. You know what feels wrong to me, he said. Watching good men burn in tanks because we couldn't breach hedgerows without exposing ourselves. You stopped that. Yes, your invention killed Germans. It's a weapon modification. That's what it's supposed to do. But it also saved Americans. More importantly, it shortened the war. Every day this war goes on, people die. Americans, Germans, French civilians caught in crossfire. Your invention helped end it faster. That saves lives on all sides, even if it doesn't feel like it. Cullen wanted to believe that. He needed to believe it. But the moral calculus of war was never simple. There was also a practical cost that nobody had anticipated: supply chain stress. The rapid Allied advance, enabled by the hedgerow cutters, meant logistics couldn't always keep up. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to be rushed to units that were suddenly miles ahead of where planners had expected them to be. Some units ran out of supplies and had to halt their advance, creating tactical vulnerabilities. Cullen found himself in meetings with logistics officers, trying to explain that his invention's success had created problems they now needed to solve. I gave you a tool that makes tanks more effective, he'd say. Now you need to figure out how to keep those tanks supplied when they're advancing faster than anyone planned for. It was a strained position for an enlisted sergeant to be in, giving advice to officers about strategic planning. But his unique perspective as the inventor meant people listened. The Army adapted, developing new logistic procedures and supply methods to accommodate the faster operational tempo that the hedgerow cutters had enabled. Perhaps the strangest cost was psychological. Cullen found himself famous within the Army, the genius mechanic who had solved an impossible problem. Soldiers would approach him asking for autographs. Officers wanted him at their briefings. War correspondents requested interviews. He hated it. I'm not comfortable with this, he told Morrison. I'm just a guy who had an idea. I didn't storm a beach or charge a machine gun nest. I just welded some metal to a tank. Why am I being treated like a hero when real heroes are dying every day? Morrison understood. You're uncomfortable because you're modest, which is admirable. But here's what you need to understand. Those soldiers charging machine gun nests, they're heroes because of their courage. You're a hero because of your mind. Both types of heroism are necessary to win wars. Accept it, Sergeant. You've earned it. Reluctantly, Cullen learned to accept the recognition, though he never quite got comfortable with it. In his mind, he was still just a mechanic from New Jersey who had figured out how to cut through bushes. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Cullen stood with his unit in a small German town, watching soldiers celebrate. There was joy, relief, exhaustion, emotions too complex to easily name. The hedge cutters had played their part in the victory. By most estimates, they had shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, possibly months. That acceleration had cascading effects: a faster advance across France, quicker liberation of Paris, an earlier crossing of the Rhine, a sooner arrival in Berlin. Every day saved meant lives saved, resources conserved, and suffering reduced. Official citations credited the Culin hedgerow cutter with materially contributing to the successful conclusion of the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations. General Eisenhower himself called it one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. Culin received the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and a commendation from the Supreme Allied Commander. He was promoted to warrant officer. His name appeared in newspapers back home. He became a symbol of American ingenuity, the average soldier who had used common sense and scrap metal to solve a problem that had stumped experts. But as he stood in that German town watching the celebrations, Cullen felt empty. The problem he had solved no longer mattered. The war was over. The hedgerows of Normandy were a year in the past. His invention, revolutionary as it had been, was now just a footnote in the history of a conflict that had killed tens of millions. "You're thinking too much again," Kowalski said, appearing beside him with 2 bottles of liberated German beer. "Just reflecting," Cullen replied, accepting a bottle. "A year ago, I was welding prongs onto a tank, hoping my idea would work. Now the war's over, and I'm trying to figure out what any of it meant." "It meant you saved lives," Kowalski said simply. "My life? Probably," he added. "I was infantry before I got transferred to your welding crew." If I'd stayed infantry, if tanks hadn't been able to breach hedgerows, I'd probably be dead. So would hundreds of other guys. Your invention mattered, Sarge. Don't ever doubt that. They drank in silence, watching the sunset over a ruined Germany. Cullen thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. If he dismissed his initial idea as too simple, if Morrison had refused permission, if the first test had failed, if the combat trial had gone wrong, any one of those moments could have changed everything. You know what's strange? Cullen said after a while. I keep thinking about German tankers. They were sitting behind hedgerows, confident they were safe. Then suddenly, American tanks are bursting through barriers that were supposed to be impenetrable. What must that have felt like, to have the rules of warfare change on you overnight? Probably felt like losing, Kowalski replied, which is what they deserved for starting this whole mess. Cullen nodded, but he couldn't quite shake the thought. War was full of innovations, each side constantly trying to gain an edge, to surprise the enemy, to change the rules. His hedgerow cutter was just one example. There had been countless others: radar, proximity fuses, improved armor, better tactics. Each innovation made someone's defensive position obsolete, their careful preparations worthless. That was the nature of warfare, but it was also the nature of progress. When you solved a problem in war, you weren't just defeating the enemy. You were proving that problem could be solved, that human ingenuity could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. I wonder what will happen to all those cutters now, Cullen mused. Thousands of tanks with my prongs welded on. What do you do with them when there are no more hedgerows to cut through? Scrap them, probably, Kowalski said, or leave them on as souvenirs. Either way, they did their job. That's all any tool can ask for. Curtis Culin returned home to New Jersey in late 1945, carrying decorations and memories but ready to leave the war behind. He went back to his old job, fixing cars and trucks in a small garage. The skills that had made him a wartime innovator served him well in peacetime. He was good with machines, good at solving problems, good at seeing solutions others missed. But he never talked much about the hedgerow cutter. When customers or friends would ask about his war experiences, he'd deflect. I was a mechanic, fixed tanks, nothing exciting. He didn't mention the medals, the innovations, or the fact that his invention had changed the course of the Normandy campaign. His wife, Margaret, once asked him why he was so reluctant to discuss his wartime achievements. "You're a genuine hero," she said. "You should be proud." "I'm proud of what I did," Cullen replied quietly, "but I'm not proud of what it was for. I made a tool that helped kill people. It saved American lives, which matters, but it was still about killing. I'd rather focus on fixing things now, not on how I helped break things then." Over the decades, military historians gradually recognized the significance of the Culin hedgerow cutter. It appeared in books about the Normandy campaign, in documentaries about wartime innovations, and in military training manuals as an example of field expedient engineering. But Culin himself remained largely unknown outside military history circles. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, a young historian named David Carter tracked down Culin, now 73 years old and long retired. Carter was writing a book about tactical innovations in World War II and wanted to interview the inventor of the hedgerow cutter. "Mr. Culin, do you understand how significant your invention was?" Carter asked during their interview. Military analysts estimate it shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks. It saved thousands of lives. It changed tank warfare doctrine. And it all came from you, a sergeant with no engineering degree, in just 48 hours. Culin was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that Carter would include in his book as a perfect summary of American ingenuity. "I wasn't special. I was just a guy who knew how machines worked and saw a problem that needed solving. The special part was that the Army gave me a chance to try. How many other good ideas got dismissed because they came from the wrong person? How many problems went unsolved because someone said that's not how we do things? I got lucky. My crazy idea got tested. But I guarantee you, there were 100 other guys with equally good ideas that nobody listened to." "But your idea worked," Carter pressed. "That makes you special." "My idea worked because people gave it a chance," Cullen corrected. "Captain Morrison could have said no. The test crew could have refused. Division could have rejected it after the first combat trial, but they didn't. They looked at the idea, not at who was suggesting it. That's the real lesson. Not that I was some genius, but that good ideas can come from anywhere if you're willing to listen. Curtis Culin died in 1963. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he'd been a mechanic, a veteran, and a quiet man who preferred fixing things to talking about them. It didn't mention the hedgerow cutter. Most of his neighbors never knew that the old man who'd fix their cars had changed the course of World War II. But in military museums across America and Europe, examples of the Culin hedgerow cutter are preserved, chunks of steel welded to the front of Sherman tanks. Simple and crude-looking, but revolutionary in their effectiveness. Plaques explain what they are and what they did, and occasionally they mention the name Curtis Culin, the mad mechanic who refused to accept that problems were unsolvable.